The morning sun painted the Afghan mountains in shades of gold and crimson as Captain Sarah Mitchell ran her pre-flight checklist for the third time. Her fingers moved with practiced precision across the instrument panel of the CH-53 Super Stallion, the massive helicopter that had become her second home. At 32 years old, she was one of only a handful of female helicopter pilots in the Marine Corps, and she'd fought tooth and nail for every hour of flight time. The base was just beginning to stir, mechanics rolling out equipment, Marines jogging in formation, the smell of coffee and jet fuel mixing in the cool morning air. "Looking good, Captain," her crew chief, Sergeant Dave Wilson, called up from the tarmac. He was checking the external components, his weathered hands moving over the aircraft with the care of a man who knew his life depended on every bolt being tight. Sarah gave him a thumbs up, then returned to her checklist. It was supposed to be a routine day, supply runs to forward operating bases, maybe a medical evacuation if needed. Nothing unusual, nothing dangerous. 500 miles to the northeast, Lieutenant Colonel James Rivera was having a very different morning. Rivera stood in the pre-dawn darkness, watching his battalion of 540 Marines prepare for what intelligence had promised would be a straightforward operation. At 46, he'd led men into combat more times than he could count, and something about this mission felt wrong. The intelligence report sat in his pocket. Enemy forces had reportedly abandoned the valley they were tasked to secure. It would be a simple show of force operation. Move in, establish presence, move out. Clean and simple. "Sir, 3rd Platoon is ready to move," his executive officer reported. Rivera nodded, pushing down the unease in his gut. Intel was intel. You trusted it or you didn't do your job. All units move out. The Marines advanced in tactical formation, spreading across the valley floor as the sun crept over the mountain peaks. The terrain was brutal, rocky, with steep ridges on both sides creating a natural corridor. Perfect for an ambush, Rivera thought, then mentally kicked himself. He was being paranoid. The valley was silent except for the crunch of boots on stone and the occasional radio check. "Command, this is Alpha 6, reaching checkpoint Bravo. No contact," Rivera reported. "Copy that, Alpha 6. Proceed to objective." They pushed deeper into the valley. 1 mile, 2 miles. The walls seemed to grow higher around them, the passage narrower. Rivera's Marines were professionals, weapons ready, eyes scanning, moving like the well-oiled machine they were. Young faces covered in camouflage paint, some barely 20 years old, others veterans of multiple deployments. All of them trusting him to bring them home. That's when Rivera saw it, a glint of metal on the ridge to his left. His blood turned to ice. "Ambush, take cover." The valley exploded. Machine gun fire erupted from every direction, left ridge, right ridge, from positions ahead and behind. It was perfectly coordinated, perfectly executed. They'd walked straight into a kill box. RPGs screamed through the air, exploding among his Marines. Men were falling, screaming, diving for whatever cover they could find in the rocky terrain. "Return fire! Return fire!" Rivera shouted into his radio, but his voice was nearly drowned out by the deafening roar of automatic weapons. Tracers lit up the morning sky like deadly fireworks. The enemy had the high ground, superior numbers, and the element of surprise. This wasn't an abandoned valley, it was a carefully prepared trap. Alpha 6 were taking heavy casualties. Request immediate support. His platoon leader screamed over the radio. Rivera's mind raced through tactical options. They were pinned down in a valley with no cover, surrounded on all sides. Retreat would mean running a gauntlet through the narrow passage they just traveled, suicide. Advancing meant charging uphill into prepared positions, also suicide. They needed air support, artillery, extraction, something, anything. He grabbed his radio with shaking hands. "Command, this is Alpha 6. We are under heavy attack. I repeat, we are under heavy attack. Estimated enemy force, battalion strength or greater. We need immediate close air support and emergency extraction. We have multiple casualties." The response came through crackling static. Alpha 6, be advised, massive sandstorm system approaching your location. All aircraft are being grounded. Eta of storm, 6 hours. Rivera's heart stopped. 6 hours. Half his battalion would be dead in 6 hours. Negative command. You don't understand, we are in a kill box. We need evac now. We cannot hold this position. Alpha 6, we understand your situation, but no aircraft can fly in the approaching storm conditions. You need to establish a defensive perimeter and hold until weather clears. When will the weather clear? Rivera's voice cracked with desperation. A long pause. Then, estimated 24 to 48 hours, Alpha 6. We're sorry. You're going to have to dig in. Rivera looked around at his Marines. Young men and women scrambling for cover, returning fire, dragging wounded comrades behind rocks. Blood stained the sand. The screams of the wounded mixed with the constant crack of gunfire. And on the horizon he could see it now. A massive wall of sand and dust rolling toward them like an angry god, darkening the sky. They had no air support coming, no artillery in range, no extraction possible. They were 500 miles from the nearest base, surrounded by an enemy force that outnumbered them 3-1, with a killer sandstorm bearing down on them. "Sir, what are your orders?" his XO asked, blood running down his face from a shrapnel wound. Rivera looked at his Marines, 540 souls he'd led into this valley. 540 lives now depending on a miracle. He picked up his rifle and moved to the line. "We dig in, we fight, and we survive until someone comes for us." But as another explosion rocked the valley and more of his Marines fell, James Rivera wondered if anyone would make it in time. 500 miles away, Sarah Mitchell had no idea that her routine day was about to become anything but routine. She had no idea that within hours, she'd face the most important decision of her life. The storm was coming, and time was running out. Sarah Mitchell was reviewing fuel consumption reports when the first distress call crackled through the operations center speakers. She glanced up from her paperwork, momentarily distracted by the urgent tone in the voice. The operations center at Camp Leatherneck was normally a controlled chaos of activity, radio operators coordinating flights, intelligence officers studying maps, logistics personnel tracking supplies. But something in that voice made everyone stop. "Command, this is Alpha 6. We are under heavy attack. I repeat, we are under heavy attack." Sarah's pen froze mid-signature. "Alpha 6. That was Lieutenant Colonel Rivera's call sign. She knew Rivera, a solid officer, not one to panic. If he was calling for help, the situation was bad. She stood up and moved closer to the radio station, her heart rate picking up. The radio operator, a young corporal who looked barely old enough to shave, was frantically typing coordinates into his computer. The voice continued, now more desperate. "Estimated enemy force, battalion strength or greater. We need immediate close air support and emergency extraction. We have multiple casualties." "Oh God," someone whispered behind her. Colonel Richard Hayes burst through the operations center door, his uniform half-buttoned like he'd been dressing while running. "Sitrep, now," he barked. "Sir, Alpha 6, Lieutenant Colonel Rivera's battalion, is under attack in the Kandahar Valley. They're reporting heavy casualties and requesting immediate extraction," the radio operator reported, his voice cracking slightly. Hayes grabbed the meteorology report from the nearest desk, his eyes scanning it rapidly. Sarah watched his face go pale. She already knew what he was seeing. She'd reviewed the same report an hour ago. A massive sandstorm system, Category 5 intensity, was barreling toward the region. Wind speeds exceeding 80 miles per hour, zero visibility, conditions that would tear helicopters from the sky like paper kites. "How long until the storm hits their position?" Hayes demanded. 6 hours, sir, maybe less." Hayes grabbed the radio microphone. His hand was shaking. Sarah noticed because she'd never seen the colonel's hand shake before. Alpha 6, be advised, massive sandstorm system approaching your location. All aircraft are being grounded. Eta of storm, 6 hours. The response came immediately, Rivera's voice now edged with panic. Negative command. You don't understand, we are in a kill box. We need evac now. We cannot hold this position. Sarah felt her stomach twist into knots. She'd been in combat zones. She knew what kill box meant. Rivera's Marines were surrounded, pinned down, being systematically slaughtered. Alpha 6, we understand your situation, but no aircraft can fly in the approaching storm conditions. You need to establish a defensive perimeter and hold until weather clears, Hayes said, and Sarah could hear the agony in his voice. When will the weather clear? The meteorologist, a Navy lieutenant standing near the weather station, held up a hand with 2 fingers extended, then 4. Sarah's heart sank. Estimated 24 to 48 hours, Alpha 6. We're sorry. You're going to have to dig in. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the constant background chatter of radio communications seemed to quiet. Everyone in the operations center understood what had just happened. They just told 540 Marines they were on their own for the next 2 days. Sarah stared at the radio as if she could will it to give different information. 48 hours. The Marines would be overrun in 6. She'd been to enough memorial services, seen enough flag-draped coffins. She knew exactly what 48 hours meant. Sir, she heard herself saying, stepping forward. Sir, I can fly in this. Hayes turned to her, his face carved from stone. Captain Mitchell, did you not hear the meteorology report? Category 5 sandstorm. No one can fly in those conditions. I've flown in bad weather before, sir. If we go now, before the storm fully develops. Before it fully develops, it's still a Category 3, which is also unflyable, Hayes interrupted, his voice rising. Captain, I understand your desire to help, but we're not sacrificing pilots and crews on a suicide mission. That's final. Another voice crackled over the radio, younger, more frightened. Command, this is Bravo 2-3. We're being overrun on the east flank. We need support. Gunfire chattered in the background, punctuated by explosions and screaming. Sarah recognized that voice immediately. Lieutenant Jake Peterson. They'd gone through flight school together, had been friends for 6 years. Jake had stood beside her at her promotion ceremony. She'd been at his wedding last summer, had danced with his new wife, had promised to be godmother to their first child. Jake, she whispered. The operations center erupted into controlled chaos as more distress calls came through. Sarah stood frozen, listening to the voices of men and women fighting for their lives 500 miles away. Each transmission brought worse news, more casualties, dwindling ammunition, enemy forces closing in. Command, we have 23 KIA, 37 wounded. We need medevac. Negative on medevac, all aircraft grounded. The radio operator responded mechanically, following protocol even as his voice broke. 23 dead. Sarah did the math automatically. That was just in the first 30 minutes. By the time the storm cleared, there wouldn't be anyone left to rescue. Hayes was on another radio now, calling every favor he had, trying to get artillery support, air strikes from high-altitude bombers, anything that could help. But Sarah could see it in his face. There was nothing. The Marines were too deep in the valley, too surrounded. Any bombardment risked killing their own people. The only option was extraction, and extraction was impossible. Captain Mitchell, Hayes said, turning to her after he'd exhausted all other options. His face looked like it had aged 10 years in the last hour. I need you to understand something. If we send birds into that storm, we don't get back those Marines. We just add dead pilots to the count. We'd be trading 5 or 6 lives for zero gain. That's not strategy, that's waste. With all due respect, sir, those aren't just numbers on a casualty report. Those are Marines. You think I don't know that? Hayes roared, slamming his fist on the desk. The entire operations center went silent. Sarah had never seen the colonel lose his composure. "You think I don't know every single one of those 540 Marines has a family, that they have mothers and fathers and wives and children waiting for them? I have to call those families, Captain. I have to look them in the eye and tell them their sons and daughters aren't coming home. Don't you dare lecture me about what those Marines mean." He took a shuddering breath, composing himself. When he spoke again, his voice was quiet, almost broken. "But I won't add your family to that list. I won't trade certain deaths for probable deaths. Stand down, Captain. That's an order." Sarah opened her mouth to argue, then closed it. What could she say? Hayes was right from a tactical standpoint. Flying into the storm was suicide. She'd be killing herself and her crew for almost zero chance of success. Almost zero, but not quite zero. She watched the radar display showing the storm, a massive red blob crawling across the screen like a cancer. She listened to the radio transmissions growing more desperate by the minute. She thought about Jake, about the other pilots she'd trained with who'd transferred to ground units, about the young Marines she'd seen boarding transport planes with eager faces and terrified eyes. "Permission to be dismissed, sir," she said quietly. Hayes studied her face for a long moment. Whatever he saw there made him nod slowly. "Dismissed, Captain. Get some rest. Tomorrow's going to be a long day." Sarah walked out of the operations center into the harsh sunlight. The base continued its normal operations around her, helicopters taking off for local runs, Marines drilling, the mundane routine of military life. But she could still hear those voices in her head, echoing from the radio speakers. "We're dying out here." She looked toward the flight line where her CH-53 Super Stallion sat waiting, its rotors still in the morning sun. Then she looked at the horizon, where the first signs of the approaching storm were visible, a dark smudge against the blue sky, growing larger by the minute. Sarah Mitchell walked to her quarters, closed the door behind her, and sat on her bunk. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through her photos, Jake and his wife on their wedding day, her goddaughter's first birthday party, her own promotion ceremony, her parents at her college graduation, beaming with pride. All the moments she'd never have if she got court-martialed or died. But what haunted her more, what she knew would haunt her every day for the rest of her life, was imagining 540 families receiving folded flags and empty condolences. She had 6 hours before the storm hit, 6 hours to decide who she was going to be. The clock was ticking. Midnight at Camp Leatherneck felt like the end of the world. Sarah Mitchell sat alone in the empty hangar, her back against the cold metal of her CH-53 Super Stallion's landing gear. The massive helicopter loomed above her in the darkness, a 70-foot beast of metal and machinery that had carried countless Marines to safety over her 3 years of deployment. Now it sat grounded, silent, useless. She'd been sitting there for 4 hours, unable to sleep, unable to think about anything else. The operations center had finally gone quiet an hour ago, not because the situation had improved, but because Rivera's Marines had been forced to maintain radio silence to preserve battery power and avoid giving away their positions. The last transmission had been devastating. 47 KIA, 63 wounded, ammunition at 30%. We'll hold as long as we can. Tell our families we love them. 47 dead. That number kept echoing in Sarah's mind. 47 mothers would get that knock on the door. 47 flag-draped coffins, and that was just the beginning. By dawn, it would be 100. By the time the storm cleared, maybe all 540. Her phone buzzed. A text from her sister back in Ohio. "Mom's birthday dinner was amazing. She keeps bragging about her daughter, the Marine pilot. When are you coming home? We miss you." Sarah stared at the message, her eyes burning with unshed tears. Home. What did home even mean anymore? She joined the Marines to serve, to protect, to make a difference. But what difference was she making sitting in this hangar while men and women died 500 miles away? She heard footsteps approaching through the darkness. Sarah didn't turn around. She already knew who it was by the distinctive uneven gait. Sergeant Dave Wilson, her crew chief, had injured his leg in a hard landing 2 years ago, and it had never quite healed right. "Figured I'd find you here, Captain," Wilson said quietly, settling down beside her with a grunt. He was 43, old for an enlisted Marine, with 2 kids in college and a wife who worried about him constantly. He'd saved Sarah's life once during a medical evacuation gone wrong, and she'd saved his during an emergency landing in a dust storm. They'd bled together, flown together, survived together. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked. "Haven't slept in 16 hours, Wilson admitted. "Keep thinking about those Marines out there. I got a nephew with Rivera's battalion. Kid's 20 years old, just joined up last year because he wanted to be like his uncle." He laughed bitterly. "Some role model I am, huh? Can't even figure out how to save him." Sarah turned to look at him. "Jake Peterson is out there, my best friend from flight school." "Yeah, I know." Wilson pulled out a pack of cigarettes, then remembered they were in a hangar full of fuel and put them away. "Hell of a thing, isn't it? We've got the bird, we've got the training, we've got everything we need to go get them, except permission." They sat in silence for a long moment. The hangar was so quiet Sarah could hear the wind beginning to pick up outside, the first whispers of the approaching storm. "I've been thinking," Sarah said slowly, "about why I became a pilot." "Why's that?" "My grandfather was a helicopter pilot in Vietnam, flew Hueys for dust-off missions, medical evacuations. He told me once that he'd flown into landing zones so hot, so surrounded by enemy fire that command had declared them off-limits. But he went anyway because there were wounded men who needed him." She paused, running her hand along the helicopter's cold metal. "He got court-martialed for it, lost his rank, nearly went to prison, but he saved 37 lives that day. He told me right before he died that he'd do it again in a heartbeat, because that's what the job was. Not following orders, saving Marines." Wilson was quiet for a moment. Then, "Your grandfather was a braver man than most." "Or crazier." "Sometimes there's not much difference." Wilson stood up, his knees cracking. "Whatever you're thinking about doing, Captain, you should know something. Marcus called me 2 hours ago. Then Amy called. They're both in their quarters right now, wide awake, thinking the same thing you're thinking." Sarah felt her heart skip. Marcus Thompson was her co-pilot, a talented 28-year-old from Texas with a pregnant wife back home. Amy Chen was her door gunner, tough as nails and loyal to a fault. They were her crew, her family in this desert hell. "They know what it would mean?" Sarah asked quietly. "Court-martial, prison time, the end of their careers." "They know. They also know what it means to abandon 540 Marines." Wilson held out his hand to help her up. "The bird's fueled and ready. Maintenance did a full check this evening. She's in perfect condition. Weather report says the storm hits in 2 hours. If someone were crazy enough to fly, now would be the time, before it gets worse." Sarah took his hand and stood, her decision crystallizing like ice forming on a winter lake. She'd been lying to herself for the last 4 hours, pretending she had a choice. But she'd known from the moment she heard Jake's voice over that radio what she was going to do. Everything else had just been fear talking, self-preservation, the rational part of her brain trying to keep her alive. But there were 540 Marines who needed her to be brave instead of rational. "Dave," she said carefully, "if someone were to take this helicopter without authorization, would you try to stop them?" Wilson smiled grimly. "Captain, I'm just a crew chief. I maintain helicopters, I don't guard them. If someone stole one in the middle of the night, I'd probably sleep right through it, especially if I'd accidentally left the keys in the ignition." He pulled a key ring from his pocket and pressed it into her hand. Hypothetically speaking, of course. Sarah's fingers closed around the cold metal keys. The weight of them felt like the weight of the world. This was it. The moment where she chose who she was going to be. The obedient officer who followed orders and lived with the guilt, or the reckless pilot who threw away everything for a chance to make a difference. I need to talk to Marcus and Amy, she said. They're already on their way. As if on cue, two figures emerged from the darkness at the hangar entrance. Even in silhouette, Sarah recognized them instantly. Marcus walked with the confident swagger of a natural pilot. Amy moved with the compact efficiency of someone trained to fight in tight spaces. They approached without saying a word. The three of them stood before Sarah in the dim light, their faces serious, determined, terrified, and brave all at once. You know what this means, Sarah said, looking at each of them in turn. I can't order you to come with me. This has to be your choice. If we do this, we'll probably be court-martialed. We might die in that storm. Our families will suffer. Our careers will be over. Everything we've worked for will be gone. Captain, Marcus interrupted, his Texas drawl thicker than usual. My wife is 8 months pregnant. I've got a daughter I haven't even met yet coming in 4 weeks. I got everything to lose. He paused, his jaw tight. But I also got everything to lose if I let 540 Marines die because I was too scared to fly. My daughter's going to ask me one day what I did in the war. I want to tell her I saved lives, not that I sat on my ass while good people died because it was safer. I'm in, Amy said simply. Those Marines would come for us. We go for them. Sarah felt tears threatening again, but she blinked them back. There would be time for tears later if they survived. Wilson, you're staying here. You've got kids in college, and I need someone on the ground who can coordinate with us if we make it back. Like hell I'm staying, Wilson growled. You need a crew chief, and I'm the best you've got. My kids are grown, Captain, they'll understand, and Sarah, he used her first name, something he never did, you're not doing this alone. We're a crew. We live together or die together. Sarah looked at the 4 faces surrounding her, her family in this place of sand and blood and sacrifice. She thought about all the reasons this was insane, all the rational arguments against it. Then she thought about 47 flag-draped coffins and Jake Peterson's wife crying at a funeral. All right, she said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. We do this together. Pre-flight check in 10 minutes. We launch in 20. And if anyone wants to back out, I won't think less of you. Nobody moved. Okay then, Sarah said, turning toward the helicopter. Let's go get our Marines. Behind them, the wind howled louder as the storm raced toward them across the desert. On the horizon, lightning flickered in the approaching wall of sand. They had maybe 90 minutes before all hell broke loose. Sarah climbed into the cockpit, her hands moving across the controls she knew better than her own heartbeat. Marcus slid into the co-pilot seat beside her. Amy and Wilson took their positions in the back. The engines whined to life, the rotors beginning their slow rotation. That's when the hangar lights blazed on. Colonel Hayes stood in the entrance, his uniform immaculate despite the late hour, his face an unreadable mask. Sarah's heart stopped. He'd come to stop them. Of course he had. She'd been naive to think they could just steal a helicopter without someone noticing. Hayes walked slowly toward the helicopter, stopping just below the cockpit window. He looked up at Sarah, and for a long moment they just stared at each other. Then Hayes did something Sarah never expected. He saluted. Captain Mitchell, he said, his voice barely audible over the spinning rotors, I'm ordering you to stand down. He paused, then added more quietly, but I'm a sound sleeper. Sometimes I don't notice things happening at night. Sometimes helicopters malfunction and take off on their own. And sometimes heroes do what they have to do, orders be damned. He stepped back, maintaining his salute. Bring them home, Captain, all of them. That's an order I can't officially give you, but it's the one that matters. Sarah returned the salute, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. Yes, sir. Hayes dropped his salute and pulled out his radio. All units be advised. We have a rogue bird taking off. Equipment malfunction. The pilot is attempting to return to base but may be experiencing radio difficulties. He looked up at Sarah one last time. God be with you. Sarah pulled the collective. and the CH-53 Super Stallion lifted into the night sky, turning toward the approaching storm and the 540 Marines waiting to die in the darkness beyond. There was no turning back now. The helicopter climbed into the darkness, leaving the safety of Camp Leatherneck behind. Sarah's hands were steady on the controls, but her heart hammered against her ribs so hard she thought Marcus might hear it in the seat beside her. The base lights grew smaller below them, tiny pinpricks of civilization in an ocean of blackness. Ahead, the horizon had disappeared entirely, swallowed by the approaching storm. "Jesus Christ," Marcus whispered, staring at the wall of darkness before them. "Sarah, that thing is massive." He was right. The sandstorm dominated the sky like a living creature, lightning flickering in its depths, the entire mass rotating slowly as it devoured everything in its path. Sarah had flown through storms before. It was part of the job, but nothing like this. This was biblical. This was the kind of storm that destroyed cities and reshaped landscapes. And they were flying straight into it. "Radio check," Sarah said, forcing her voice to remain calm. "Everyone confirm status." "Co-pilot ready," Marcus responded, his hands already moving across his instrument panel, checking systems. "Crew chief ready," Wilson called from the back. "All systems green for now." "Door gunner ready," Amy added. "Weapons hot, just in case we run into something besides weather." Sarah keyed the radio to the emergency frequency. "Rivera, this is Angel One. Do you copy?" Static, then faint and crackling. "Angel One, who the hell is Angel One? All aircraft are grounded." "Rivera, it's Captain Mitchell. I'm inbound to your position with extraction capability. Give me an update on your situation." A long pause. When Rivera's voice came back, it was thick with emotion. "Mitchell, you're violating direct orders. They'll court-martial you." "Probably. Now give me a sitrep, Colonel." Another pause. Then Rivera's voice turned professional, focused. "We're at 63% combat effective. 51 KIA, 78 wounded. Enemy forces have pulled back temporarily, but we're still surrounded. Ammunition at 25%. We've got maybe 4 hours before they overrun us. Mitchell, the storm." "I see it, Colonel. I'll be there in 45 minutes. Prep your wounded for immediate evac. We'll take them out first." "Mitchell, you can't. The storm will tear you apart." "Then I guess you better have my LZ ready." Sarah switched off the radio before Rivera could argue further. Marcus was staring at her. 45 minutes. "Sarah, we're flying into a Category 5 sandstorm. We might not make it in 45 minutes. We might not make it at all." "Then we better fly fast." Sarah pushed the throttles forward, and the Super Stallion surged ahead, racing toward the storm at maximum speed. The first tendrils of the storm reached them 20 minutes into the flight. The smooth air suddenly turned violent, the helicopter bucking like a wild horse. Sarah fought the controls, her arms straining as the wind tried to flip them sideways. Sand began pelting the windscreen, first in scattered bursts, then in sheets that reduced visibility to almost nothing. "Switching to instruments," Sarah announced, her eyes moving to the cockpit displays. Flying by instruments was standard procedure in poor visibility, but it required absolute trust in technology and skills. One mistake, one misread gauge, and they'd fly straight into a mountain. "Altitude 2,000 feet and dropping," Marcus called out. "Wind shear, we're caught in a downdraft." Sarah pulled back on the collective, fighting to maintain altitude. The engines screamed as they fought against forces of nature that dwarfed their mechanical power. The helicopter dropped another 100 feet before she managed to level off, her muscles burning with the effort. "That was close," Wilson muttered from the back. Something in the cargo bay had come loose and was rattling around. Too close. The storm intensified. Lightning split the darkness around them, turning the sand into a strobing nightmare of brown and gold. Thunder crashed so loud it vibrated through the airframe. The wind shifted constantly, updrafts, downdrafts, crosswinds that hit them from angles that seemed impossible. Sarah was flying on instinct now, feeling the helicopter's movements, anticipating the wind's fury before it struck. "Terrain ahead," Marcus suddenly shouted. "Ridge line at 11 o'clock, 300 yards." Sarah could barely see it, a darker shadow in the swirling chaos. She yanked the stick hard right. The rotor tips passed within feet of jagged rock that materialized from the storm like a ghost. Amy yelped in the back as the helicopter tilted 45 degrees, cargo sliding across the deck. "Sorry," Sarah grunted, leveling out. Her hands were cramping from gripping the controls so hard. Sweat poured down her face despite the cold. She'd been flying for less than 30 minutes and already felt like she'd been in the cockpit for days. "Wind speed 85 knots, Marcus read from his instruments. "Sarah, this is insane. The airframe can't take much more of this." "It doesn't have to take much more, just enough to get there and back." Sarah's voice was steel, but inside she was terrified. Marcus was right. They were pushing the helicopter beyond its design limits. Every violent gust, every sudden drop, every rattling shake could be the one that tore something critical loose. A warning alarm blared. "Hydraulic pressure dropping in System 2, Marcus called out, his fingers flying across switches. "Compensating with System 1. "How long can we fly on one system?" Sarah asked. "Long enough, maybe, if nothing else breaks." "Nothing else better break," Wilson growled, "because I left my parachute back at base." Despite everything, Sarah almost laughed. Leave it to Wilson to crack jokes while they were flying through hell. The GPS coordinates clicked down slowly. 500 miles to target, 480, 460. Each mile was earned through pain and skill and sheer stubborn will. Sarah's world had narrowed to the instruments before her: altitude, heading, airspeed, artificial horizon. Everything else was just noise, just fear, just doubt trying to creep in. "Amy, how you doing back there?" Sarah called. "I've thrown up twice. My arms feel like jelly from holding on, and I'm pretty sure I saw my life flash before my eyes about 10 minutes ago," Amy responded. "But I'm good, Captain. Keep flying." Another massive turbulence hit them, dropping them 200 feet in seconds. Warning alarms shrieked. Sarah pulled up with everything she had, the engines howling in protest. They stopped falling 50 feet above the desert floor, so close Sarah could see individual rocks in the lightning flashes. "That's it," Marcus yelled. "Sarah, we need to turn back. We're going to die out here." "We're not turning back," Sarah shouted over the storm's roar. "Those Marines are already dying. They don't get to turn back, so neither do we." Marcus stared at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Okay, then let's finish this." The radio crackled to life. Rivera's voice, barely audible through the static. "Angel 1, we have visual on the storm. My God, Mitchell, you actually flew through that." "Still flying through it, Colonel. ETA 15 minutes. Is my LZ clear?" "Negative. Enemy forces have the LZ zeroed in. You'll be landing under fire." "Wouldn't be the Marines if it was easy," Sarah replied. "Prep your wounded. We're coming in hot." She pushed the helicopter harder, faster, racing against time and probability. The storm was trying to kill them with every gust, every blast of wind and sand. The helicopter was screaming in mechanical agony. Her crew was terrified but holding together. And somewhere ahead in the darkness, 540 Marines were waiting to see if hope could fly through a sandstorm. Sarah Mitchell had never been religious, but she found herself praying the helicopter would hold together, praying she had the skill to land in a combat zone during a Category 5 storm, praying that this insane gamble would pay off. The GPS blinked, 10 miles to target. "Everyone hold on," Sarah said quietly. "This is where it gets interesting." Lightning illuminated the valley ahead, and for just a moment Sarah saw them. Hundreds of muzzle flashes in the darkness, tracers arcing through the storm, explosions blooming like deadly flowers. Rivera's Marines fighting for their lives. She was almost there. "Angel 1 to all Marines," she transmitted. "Your ride is here, let's go home." Then she dove into the heart of the battle. The valley floor materialized from the sandstorm like a vision from hell. Through brief gaps in the swirling sand, Sarah caught glimpses of the battlefield below, muzzle flashes lighting up the darkness like deadly fireflies, explosions sending columns of fire into the storm, and small figures running, fighting, dying in the chaos. The radio exploded with urgent voices overlapping each other, Marines calling targets, screaming for medics, coordinating fire. "LZ is 200 yards ahead," Marcus shouted, pointing at the GPS coordinates. "I can't see it through the sand." "I don't need to see it," Sarah replied, her jaw set. "I can feel it." She was flying on pure instinct now, letting the helicopter become an extension of her body. Every slight change in wind pressure, every subtle shift in the aircraft's behavior told her where she was, how high, how fast. The instruments were failing anyway. Sand was getting into everything, gumming up systems, scratching the windscreen until it looked like frosted glass. "Angel 1, this is Alpha 6. Rivera's voice cut through the radio static. "Pop green smoke when you see my position." Sarah scanned the darkness below. There, a cluster of Marines dug in behind a low ridge, returning fire against enemies she couldn't even see. She keyed her radio. "Rivera, I see you. No smoke, it'll just mark your position for the enemy. Get your wounded ready to move." She brought the Super Stallion down in a controlled fall, fighting the wind every foot of the way. The storm was trying to flip them, slam them into the ground, tear the rotors off. Sand blasted against the hull like a million tiny bullets. At 50 feet, she could finally see the landing zone, a small clearing barely large enough for the massive helicopter, surrounded by rocks and enemy positions. "Taking fire," Amy suddenly screamed. Bullets pinged off the armor plating, sparking in the darkness. "Contact right side, multiple shooters." "Light them up," Sarah ordered, never taking her eyes off the rapidly approaching ground. Amy's M240 machine gun roared to life, sending tracers into the storm. Somewhere in the darkness, enemy fighters were shooting at them blind, hopping to get lucky. The helicopter shuddered as rounds found their mark, punching through less armored sections. 20 feet, 10 feet. The wind gusted hard from the left, trying to push them into a boulder. Sarah compensated, overcorrected, compensated again. This wasn't flying, this was barely controlled falling with style. The landing gear touched down hard enough to rattle her teeth. "We're down. Go, go, go." Wilson was already lowering the ramp before she finished speaking. The cargo bay flooded with sand and wind and chaos. Then the Marines came running. They emerged from the storm like ghosts, dirt-covered, blood-soaked, carrying their wounded on stretchers improvised from ponchos and rifle straps. Sarah watched in her mirror as they poured into her helicopter, their faces showing a mixture of disbelief, hope, and desperate gratitude. "How many can we take?" Marcus asked, monitoring the weight indicators. 55 is max capacity," Sarah replied. "Load 55 and we go." But the Marines kept coming, wounded men screaming in agony, their brothers carrying them. A young Marine, couldn't be more than 19, stumbled up the ramp clutching his bleeding stomach. A sergeant with one arm in a makeshift sling was helping load others before himself. Rivera appeared at the cockpit window, his face covered in blood and sand. He looked like he'd aged 10 years in the last 12 hours. "Mitchell, thank God. We've got 87 critical wounded that need immediate evac." "I can take 55, maybe 60 if we push it," Sarah shouted over the roar of the rotors and gunfire. "Then take 60 and come back." Rivera slammed his hand against the hull for emphasis. "We've got men dying every minute." Sarah looked back at the cargo bay. It was already packed with Marines, far more than 55. Wilson was directing traffic, somehow managing to fit more bodies into spaces that shouldn't exist. The wounded were stacked on top of each other, sitting in laps, pressed against every surface. "Captain, we're at 70, Wilson called out. 75 the weight. Keep loading, Sarah shouted back. She didn't care about regulations anymore. She didn't care about weight limits or safety margins. She cared about the faces she could see in her mirror, young Americans who'd volunteered to serve their country and now just wanted to go home. An explosion rocked the valley, so close it lifted one side of the helicopter off the ground. Enemy forces were concentrating their fire, realizing what was happening. Bullets hammered against the armor like deadly rain. RPG, Amy screamed, her gun swiveling. She fired a long burst. Sarah saw the contrail of a rocket-propelled grenade arc through the storm, passing within feet of their tail rotor. If that had connected, they'd all be dead. 80 Marines aboard, Wilson reported. Captain, we have to go. The hydraulics are screaming. Ramp up, seal it. Sarah's hands were already moving across the controls, spooling up the engines to maximum power. The helicopter groaned under the impossible weight. Every warning light on her panel was blazing red. The aircraft wasn't designed for this. The engineers back in California would have a heart attack if they saw what she was attempting. She pulled collective. Nothing happened. Come on, baby, she whispered, pulling harder. Come on. The engine screamed. The rotors bit into the storm-choked air. The entire airframe shuddered like it was tearing itself apart. Sarah could feel every rivet straining, every bolt stressed beyond its limits. This was it. They were either going to fly or they were going to die right here in this valley. Then, impossibly, miraculously, they lifted. 6 inches off the ground. 1 foot. 2 feet. The overloaded super stallion clawed its way into the air like a wounded bird, every second feeling like it might be the last. Sarah nursed the controls with a delicacy she'd never needed before, coaxing, begging, demanding the helicopter to fly. Gaining altitude, Marcus called out, his voice cracking with relief. 50 feet, 100. More gunfire. A round punched through the cockpit canopy, passing between Sarah and Marcus so close she felt the heat. The windscreen spiderwebbed but held. Get us out of here, Wilson yelled from the back, where he was trying to provide first aid to 3 Marines simultaneously. Sarah turned the helicopter toward home, fighting the storm every inch of the way. The return flight was even worse than the approach. They were heavier, more damaged, and the storm had intensified. But she didn't care. 80 Marines were breathing in her cargo bay. 80 men and women who would have died if she'd followed orders. The flight back took 37 minutes that felt like 37 hours. Every gust threatened to knock them from the sky. Every warning alarm was a reminder that the helicopter was one malfunction away from catastrophic failure. But Sarah flew with a focus she'd never experienced before, her entire being merged with the machine, willing it to stay in the air. Camp Leatherneck appeared through the storm like a beacon of hope. Sarah lined up for landing, dropping fast and hard. The landing gear hit the tarmac with a crunch that probably damaged something expensive. She didn't care. We're down, medical teams move in, she shouted into the radio. The ramp dropped and medics swarmed aboard, pulling wounded Marines onto stretchers. Sarah watched in her mirror as the Marines who could walk helped carry those who couldn't. They were alive, 80 lives saved. But there were still 460 Marines in that valley. Wilson appeared at her cockpit window, his flight suit covered in blood, none of it his own. Captain, the bird took damage. We've got hydraulic leaks, bullet holes in critical systems, stress fractures in the tail section. The maintenance guys are saying we need at least 6 hours of repairs before. How long to patch the leaks and get her flyable? Sarah interrupted. Wilson stared at her. You can't be serious. Sarah, you just flew through hell and back. You need rest, the bird needs repairs. How long, Dave? He hesitated, then sighed. 20 minutes, maybe 30, but Captain, it won't be safe. It wasn't safe the first time. Sarah was already running post-flight checks, preparing for the next launch. Get your maintenance crews out here. We're going back. Marcus turned to look at her, his face pale. "Sarah, we barely made it back the first time. The storm's getting worse. The helicopter's damaged. We're exhausted. We can't." "There are still 460 Marines in that valley," Sarah said quietly, her hands never stopping their movement across the controls. "Rivera said they have maybe 4 hours before they're overrun. If we wait for repairs, proper rest, if we do this by the book, those Marines die. All of them." She turned to look at her crew, Wilson at the door, his weathered face showing every one of his 43 years. Amy, still gripping her machine gun, her hands shaking with adrenaline and fear. Marcus, young and talented with a baby daughter he'd never met waiting at home. "I'm going back," Sarah said simply. "Whether you come with me or not, I'm going back, but I'd rather not do it alone." The three of them looked at each other. Some wordless communication passed between them. Then Marcus smiled tiredly. "Well, I didn't survive the first trip just to miss the sequel." "My gun still has ammo," Amy added, "and those Marines need us." Wilson just nodded. "I'll get the maintenance crews. 20 minutes, Captain. Then we fly back into hell." Sarah looked out at the storm still raging beyond the base perimeter. 7 more trips. They'd need 7 more trips to get everyone out. 7 more chances to die. 7 more impossibilities to accomplish. But she'd already done the impossible once today. She could do it 6 more times. "Fuel us up," she ordered. "We're not done yet." 23 minutes later, Sarah lifted off again into the maelstrom. The maintenance crew had done what they could, patched the hydraulic leaks with speed tape and prayer, plugged the bullet holes, tightened bolts that had rattled loose from the violent flight. But they'd been honest with her. The helicopter was barely airworthy. One more hard landing, one more severe stress event, and something critical would fail. Sarah didn't tell them she was planning 6 more trips. The second flight into the valley was worse than the first. The storm had intensified to Category 5 maximum, wind speeds exceeding 100 miles per hour, visibility measured in feet rather than yards, lightning strikes so frequent the entire sky seemed to be on fire. The helicopter bucked and twisted like a living thing trying to escape her control. "This is insane," Marcus shouted over the roar of wind and engines. "Sarah, the airframe is shaking itself apart." He was right. Sarah could feel it through the controls, vibrations that hadn't been there before, responses that were sluggish and unpredictable. The helicopter was dying by degrees, and they were asking it to fly through conditions that would destroy a healthy aircraft. But there were still 380 Marines waiting. They reached the valley and descended through hell. This time, enemy forces were ready. Tracer fire lit up the storm like deadly fireworks, all of it converging on her helicopter. They'd had 30 minutes to set up better firing positions, to coordinate their attacks. "Taking heavy fire," Amy screamed, returning fire with short, controlled bursts. "They're everywhere." Sarah dropped fast, trading altitude for speed. Rounds hammered against the armor. One punched through into the cargo bay, ricocheting with a sound like a bell being struck. She hit the ground hard, too hard, and heard something in the landing gear crack. "Load up," she shouted, watching Marines sprint through the killing zone toward her bird. They came in waves, more wounded, more exhausted, more desperate. Faces covered in blood and sand and cordite. Some were carrying their dead buddies, refusing to leave them behind. Sarah's heart broke watching them, these young warriors who'd been through hell and were somehow still standing. 95 aboard, Wilson called out. 95. That was 40 over maximum capacity. The helicopter was groaning under the weight, settling lower on its damaged landing gear. An explosion detonated 20 yards away, showering them with rocks and shrapnel. The helicopter rocked sideways, nearly tipping. Sarah fought the controls, keeping them upright through sheer force of will. "We have to go now," Marcus yelled as another RPG streaked past their nose. Sarah pulled collective. The engines screamed. The rotors clawed at the air. For a terrifying moment, nothing happened. They were too heavy, too damaged, the storm too powerful. Then, inch by tortuous inch, they lifted. The flight back was a nightmare of failing systems and impossible choices. A hydraulic line burst, spraying fluid across the cockpit windscreen. The fuel gauge was dropping faster than it should. They had a leak somewhere. Warning alarms created a constant symphony of impending disaster. But they made it back, 95 more Marines safe. The third trip, Sarah could barely keep her eyes open. Adrenaline was wearing off, replaced by bone-deep exhaustion. Her hands cramped on the controls. Her back screamed from the constant tension. But there were still 285 Marines in that valley. "Captain, you need rest," Wilson said as maintenance crews swarmed the helicopter again. "You're going to make a mistake." "I'll rest when they're all home," Sarah cut him off. "How's the bird?" Wilson's face said everything. "She's dying, Sarah. The main rotor assembly has stress fractures. The tail rotor's vibrating wrong. We're losing hydraulic pressure faster than we can replace fluid. Honestly, I don't know how she's still flying." "She'll fly 6 more times," Sarah said with a certainty she didn't feel. "She has to." The fourth trip, they took ground fire before they even reached the valley. Enemy forces had figured out their flight path and positioned fighters along the route. Bullets stitched a line across the fuselage. Amy returned fire, her machine gun glowing red-hot from constant use. They loaded 98 Marines this time, an impossible number that had the helicopter's engines screaming in protest from the moment they lifted off. The return flight took 42 minutes because Sarah had to nurse every ounce of power from the dying engines, coaxing them to give just a little more, just a little longer. They landed at Leatherneck, with smoke pouring from one engine. "That engine's done," the crew chief reported. "She's got one good engine left. You can't fly combat missions on one engine." "Watch me," Sarah said, and took off again 20 minutes later. The fifth trip, Marcus threw up from exhaustion halfway to the valley. Amy was slumped in her gunner's position, so tired she could barely hold her weapon. Wilson's hands shook as he helped load Marines aboard. They were all running on fumes and determination. But they loaded 89 more Marines and somehow made it back. 2 trips left, 98 Marines still trapped. "Sarah," Marcus said as they sat in the cockpit between flights, his voice hoarse from shouting over the storm. "The bird won't make it. Look at the damage report." Sarah looked. It read like a death certificate. Primary hydraulic system failed. Secondary hydraulic system operating at 30%. Left engine destroyed. Right engine critical damage operating at 60% capacity. Tail rotor severe vibration possible structural damage. Main rotor stress fractures throughout. Fuel system multiple leaks. Electrical system intermittent failures. Any one of these issues should have grounded the aircraft. Together, they meant the helicopter was a flying coffin held together by duct tape and desperation. "One more trip," Sarah said quietly. "That's all we need. One more trip and we're done." But even as she said it, she knew the math. 98 Marines remaining. They could fit maybe 90 in the helicopter if they really pushed it. That meant leaving 8 behind. 8 Marines who would die because there wasn't room. "No," she said aloud, the words sharp and final. "We're not leaving anyone. Not one Marine gets left behind." "Sarah, it's physically impossible," Marcus started. "I've been doing impossible things all day," she interrupted. "One more won't hurt." The 6th trip into the valley was like flying a brick with wings. The helicopter responded sluggishly to every input, fighting her constantly. The remaining engine coughed and sputtered. The rotor wash felt wrong, unbalanced, like the main rotor was seconds from catastrophic failure. They landed in the valley and Sarah saw them, the last 98 Marines. These were the ones who'd held the perimeter while their brothers were evacuated. These were the ones who'd volunteered to be last. Many were wounded but still fighting. All were exhausted beyond description. Rivera jogged to her window, his face gaunt. "Mitchell, this is it. Everyone who's left." "Get them loaded," Sarah ordered. "All of them." "All of them, the bird can't." "It will get them aboard." The Marines piled in, packing themselves tighter than sardines in a can. Sitting on laps, standing pressed together, lying on top of each other. 98 human beings crammed into a space designed for 55. The helicopter settled onto its landing gear, the shocks compressing fully under the impossible weight. Wilson appeared at the cockpit. "Sarah, we're at double max capacity. The weight, the helicopter can't." "Yes, it can," Sarah said firmly. She didn't believe it, but she needed Wilson to believe she believed it. "Seal the ramp, we're leaving." As the ramp closed, enemy forces launched a final desperate assault. Machine gun fire raked across the helicopter. An RPG slammed into the tail boom, the explosion deafening. Warning alarms shrieked. The tail rotor was damaged, possibly destroyed. "We've lost tail rotor effectiveness," Marcus screamed. "We can't fly without." "Hold on." Sarah pulled collective with everything she had. The helicopter didn't lift. It couldn't lift. The weight was too much, the damage too severe, the single remaining engine not enough. They were stuck on the ground in a combat zone with nearly 100 Marines aboard and enemy forces closing in. Sarah looked at Marcus. She looked at the Marines packed into her cargo bay, their faces showing they knew this might be the end. She looked at the storm raging around them, at the damaged instruments, at every reason this couldn't work. Then she thought about her grandfather, flying into impossible situations because it was the right thing to do. "Come on, beautiful," she whispered to the helicopter. "One more miracle, that's all I need, just one more." She pushed the throttle past the red line, into the emergency power range that would destroy what was left of the engine. The helicopter shuddered. The rotor blades clawed at the air with a sound like metal tearing. Every rivet strained. Every bolt screamed. And impossibly, miraculously, they lifted off the ground. But Sarah knew immediately something was terribly wrong. The damaged tail rotor meant they had almost no directional control. The overloaded weight meant they were barely flying at all. The dying engine meant they had maybe 10 minutes of power left before complete failure. "We're not going to make it back to base," Marcus said quietly, reading the same instrument she was reading. Sarah's jaw set. "Then we'll make it as far as we can, and we'll walk the rest if we have to, but I'm not leaving these Marines in this valley." She coaxed the dying helicopter forward, trading altitude for distance, nursing every foot of forward movement from the tortured machine. The storm buffeted them mercilessly. The engine coughed and sputtered. The controls felt like they were made of rubber, responding slowly or not at all. But they flew. Somehow impossibly they flew. 1 mile from the valley, 2 miles, 3 miles. Every second was borrowed time. Every yard was a gift from a helicopter that refused to die. "Come on," Sarah whispered. "Just a little farther, just a little more." The question wasn't whether they'd make it back to base. They wouldn't. The question was whether they'd make it far enough. The engine exploded. Not a catastrophic fireball. Sarah had one tiny mercy in that moment, but a violent mechanical death rattle followed by silence. 1 second the turbine was screaming at maximum power. The next it was gone, leaving only the whistling of wind through bullet holes and the desperate whipping of rotors trying to auto-rotate. "Engine failure, we're going down," Marcus's voice cracked with terror. Sarah's hands moved with a speed born from thousands of hours of training. She lowered the collective, trading what little altitude they had for forward momentum. The helicopter began dropping from the sky like a stone, but a stone with some forward velocity. In the back, Marines shouted in alarm as the floor fell away beneath them. "Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is Angel One. We have complete engine failure, 98 souls on board, attempting emergency auto-rotation." Sarah's voice was steady despite the terror clawing at her throat. "Distance from base, She glanced at the GPS. 7 miles. 7 miles. They were 7 miles from safety with no power and 98 lives, depending on her ability to land a falling brick. "Brace for emergency landing," Wilson shouted to the Marines in back. "Crash positions, now." The ground rushed up at them with sickening speed. Sarah's world narrowed to pure instinct and training. Auto-rotation, the art of using a helicopter's falling motion to keep the rotors spinning, converting altitude into lift at the last possible second to cushion the landing. She'd practiced it 100 times in simulators, a dozen times in actual aircraft. But never overloaded by 40 tons, never with a damaged tail rotor, never with 98 lives at stake. The desert floor was a blur of sand and rock. 2,000 feet, 1,500, 1,000. She could see individual boulders now, arroyos that would flip them if they landed wrong, patches of soft sand that would catch the landing gear and send them cartwheeling. Too fast, too fast. Marcus was reading numbers, but Sarah wasn't listening. She could feel it. The speed, the descent rate, the helicopter's sluggish response to her inputs. Every instinct she developed over years of flying was screaming calculations faster than conscious thought could process. 500 feet. The Marines in back had gone silent. Even Amy had stopped firing her gun, holding on with white knuckles. 300 feet. Sarah could see a flat stretch ahead, not perfect, but it would have to do. She angled toward it, fighting the damaged tail rotor that wanted to spin them like a top. 100 feet. She began pulling collective, trading their forward speed for lift. The rotors bit into the air, slowing their descent, but not enough. They were still coming in too hot, too fast. 50 feet. Hold on, Sarah screamed. 20 feet. She pulled collective all the way to the stop, asking the rotors for every last ounce of lift they could possibly give. The helicopter's descent slowed dramatically, but not completely. They hit. The impact was like being inside a car crash and earthquake simultaneously. The landing gear collapsed instantly, sheared off by forces it was never designed to handle. The belly of the helicopter slammed into the desert floor, the screech of metal on rock deafening. They bounced once, twice, the airframe twisting. Sarah fought the controls even though they were on the ground, trying to keep them from flipping, from rolling, from tearing apart. The helicopter skidded across the desert in a shower of sparks and sand, leaving a trail of debris behind it. A rotor blade snapped off with a sound like a gunshot. The windscreen shattered. The tail boom buckled and tore partially free. They were sliding sideways now, the dying momentum carrying them toward a cluster of boulders that would crush them. They stopped 6 feet from the rocks. The sudden silence was overwhelming. For a long moment, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Sarah sat frozen in her seat, hands still gripping controls that no longer controlled anything, her entire body shaking with adrenaline. Then Wilson's voice, shaky but strong. "Everyone okay back here? Sound off." Voices began calling out from the cargo bay. "I'm good. Alive. Holy shit, we're alive." The responses came one after another, stunned, terrified, grateful. 98 voices, all still breathing. "Marcus," Sarah turned to her co-pilot. He was pressed back in his seat, eyes wide, but he nodded. I'm okay. Jesus Christ, Sarah. You just landed a dead helicopter with 100 people on board." Sarah didn't answer. She was too busy fighting back tears of relief and terror and exhaustion. They'd done it. Against every law of physics and probability and common sense, they'd gotten the last Marines out of that valley. The ramp lowered with a grinding shriek of damaged hydraulics. Marines began pouring out, some limping, some helping wounded buddies, all of them kissing the ground the moment they were clear. Rivera was one of the last off. He walked to Sarah's shattered cockpit window, tears cutting tracks through the dirt on his face. "Captain Mitchell," he said, his voice breaking, there aren't words." "Get your Marines to safety, Colonel," Sarah said quietly. "The storm's still dangerous. Camp Leatherneck will send rescue birds once it clears." Rivera saluted, his hand trembling. "Ma'am, you just saved 540 lives, every single Marine in my battalion, not one left behind." He paused, struggling with emotion. "My daughter was born 3 months ago. Her middle name is Sarah. My wife insisted. Now I know why." He turned and began organizing his Marines for the 7-mile hike to base. They moved in tactical formation even now, even exhausted and wounded, and having just survived the impossible. Marines to the core. Sarah watched them go, then slowly unbuckled her harness. Every muscle in her body screamed in protest. She'd been flying for nearly 6 hours straight through conditions that should have killed her a dozen times over. She climbed out of the cockpit and stood beside the destroyed helicopter. The Super Stallion was a total loss. Landing gear gone, rotors destroyed, tail boom hanging by a few twisted metal strands, hull riddled with bullet holes, the engine a scorched ruin. This bird would never fly again. Sarah placed her hand on the scarred metal, feeling it still warm from the destroyed engine. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for not giving up." Wilson, Marcus, and Amy joined her, all of them staring at the wreckage in disbelief. They'd pushed this machine beyond anything it was designed to do, and it had responded by giving them everything it had until there was nothing left. "We should probably start walking," Marcus said. "It's 7 miles to base." "In a sandstorm," Amy added. "This just keeps getting better." "At least nobody's shooting at us anymore," Wilson said with a tired laugh. They began walking, following the column of Marines trudging through the storm. Sarah looked back once at the destroyed helicopter sitting alone in the desert, a monument to an impossible day. Then she turned toward home. Above them, the storm began to break. The first rays of sunlight pierced the clouds, painting the desert in shades of gold. The wind was dying down. The worst had passed. 4 hours later, a rescue convoy from Camp Leatherneck found them 2 miles from base. The Marines cheered when they saw the trucks, their voices hoarse but jubilant. They'd walked through hell and made it out the other side. As Sarah climbed into the lead vehicle, Rivera's voice came over the radio. "Command, this is Alpha 6. Reporting mission status, all personnel accounted for. I say again, all personnel accounted for. 540 Marines returning home. 0 left behind." The radio operator's voice came back, thick with emotion. "Copy that, Alpha 6. Welcome home, all of you." Sarah closed her eyes and let the exhaustion finally take her. They'd done it. Against every odd, every regulation, every voice of reason that said it was impossible, they'd done it. But as the convoy rolled toward base, Sarah knew the hardest part was yet to come. She'd saved 540 lives, but she'd also disobeyed direct orders, destroyed a $30 million helicopter, and violated enough regulations to earn a court-martial that could send her to military prison. The question now wasn't whether she'd done the right thing. She knew she had. The question was whether the Marine Corps would see it that way. The base gates appeared ahead. Beyond them, Sarah could see Colonel Hayes waiting with a contingent of military police. Her reckoning had arrived. The convoy rolled through the gates of Camp Leatherneck to a sight Sarah would never forget. Thousands of Marines lined the road. Every available soul on base had turned out. As the trucks passed, they saluted. Not the crisp, regulation salutes of military protocol, but slow, deliberate gestures of respect. Some had tears streaming down their faces. Others stood at attention despite their wounds, refusing to sit even as medics tried to help them. The silence was deafening. Sarah climbed out of the truck, her legs barely holding her upright after 6 hours of flying and 4 hours of walking. Her flight suit was torn and blood-stained. Her face was covered in dirt and dried sweat. She looked like she'd been through a war, because she had. Colonel Hayes stood waiting with 4 military police officers. His face was unreadable, but his eyes held something that might have been pride, might have been sorrow, might have been both. "Captain Sarah Mitchell," he said formally, his voice carrying across the silent crowd. You are hereby placed under arrest for disobeying direct orders, unauthorized use of military equipment, reckless endangerment, and destruction of government property valued at $30 million. The MPs moved forward. Sarah stood at attention, ready to accept her fate. This was the price. She'd known it when she made the choice. Then something unexpected happened. Lieutenant Colonel Rivera stepped forward, placing himself between Sarah and the MPs. His face was set in stone. "Sir, I request to speak." "Colonel Rivera, stand down," Hayes ordered. "Sir, with respect, I will not." Rivera's voice rang out clear and strong. "Captain Mitchell saved every single Marine in my battalion, 540 lives. She flew through conditions that should have killed her 7 times. She disobeyed orders, yes, but she did so because those orders condemned my Marines to death." Another voice joined in. "Sir, I request to speak as well." It was one of Rivera's sergeants, his arm in a sling. Then another Marine stepped forward, and another. Within moments, all 540 Marines who'd been in that valley had formed a wall between Sarah and the military police. "We all request to speak, sir," Rivera said quietly. "Every single one of us." Hayes looked at the wall of Marines, then at Sarah, then back at the Marines. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he sighed deeply. "Captain Mitchell, you are confined to quarters pending investigation. Court-martial proceedings will begin in 3 days." The MPs escorted Sarah away, but she could feel every eye on her, could feel the weight of 540 grateful souls watching her go. The next 3 days were a blur. Sarah was isolated in her quarters, allowed no visitors except her appointed military attorney, a Captain Jennifer Walsh who looked barely old enough to be out of law school. Walsh was blunt from the start. "Captain, I'll be honest. The evidence against you is overwhelming. You violated direct orders from a superior officer. You stole military property. You destroyed a $30 million aircraft. Under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, you're looking at dishonorable discharge, loss of all benefits, and up to 10 years in military prison." She paused. "The only question is how hard they want to make an example of you." "I understand," Sarah said quietly. "I knew the consequences when I made the choice." "The problem is," Walsh continued, "you're also a hero. Every news outlet in the country is running your story. Female pilot saves 540 Marines is on every front page. Public opinion is overwhelmingly in your favor. But the military can't simply ignore regulations because something worked out. If they let you off, it sets a precedent that officers can disobey orders whenever they think they know better." "So what happens?" Walsh met her eyes. "We fight, and we pray the board sees what I see, a Marine who made an impossible choice and chose to save lives." The court-martial convened on a gray morning in a courtroom packed with observers. The prosecution laid out their case methodically. Drone footage showing Sarah taking off without authorization, radio logs proving she'd received and ignored direct orders, damage assessments of the destroyed helicopter, testimony from Colonel Hayes about the chain of command. It was damning, comprehensive, irrefutable. Then Walsh called her witnesses. Lieutenant Marcus Thompson testified about the flight, his voice shaking as he described Sarah's skill in impossible conditions. "I've been flying for 6 years. I've never seen anything like what Captain Mitchell did that day. She didn't just break rules, she redefined what's possible." Sergeant Dave Wilson described the Marines they'd rescued, showing photographs of wounded men being carried aboard, reading names and ages. Private First Class James Chen, 19 years old. Lance Corporal Maria Rodriguez, 21. Corporal David Washington, 23. "These aren't statistics," Wilson said, his weathered face hard as stone. "These are children, somebody's sons and daughters. Captain Mitchell brought them home." Then Lieutenant Colonel Rivera took the stand. "Colonel Rivera," Walsh began, "in your military opinion, What would have happened if Captain Mitchell had not violated orders that day? Rivera looked directly at the three-officer board judging Sarah's fate. "Ma'am, I would have lost my entire battalion. All 540 Marines would have been killed or captured within 12 hours. We had no ammunition left, no support available, no chance of survival." He paused. Captain Mitchell didn't just save lives. She prevented the single largest loss of American forces in a single engagement in 20 years. The prosecution tried to argue that Rivera couldn't know for certain what would have happened, that rescue might have been possible after the storm. Rivera shut that down immediately. "Sir, I had 47 dead and 78 wounded before Captain Mitchell arrived. By the time the storm cleared 2 days later, we would have been massacred. There is no scenario where we survive without her intervention. None." The most powerful testimony came from an unexpected source. One of the rescued Marines, a 19-year-old private named Tyler Bennett, had written a letter that his mother insisted on reading to the court. She was a small woman with graying hair and trembling hands. "My son wrote this 2 days ago. He asked me to read it if he couldn't." Her voice broke. "He died yesterday from complications from his wounds, but he wanted these words heard." She read, "Captain Mitchell knew she'd be court-martialed. She knew she might die. She came anyway because Marines don't leave Marines behind. She flew through hell 7 times for us. I owe her my life. I got to call my mom one last time because of her. I got to say goodbye to my little sister. Whatever happens to Captain Mitchell, I want everyone to know she's the reason I made it home. She's a hero." There wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom. The board deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, the head officer, a stern-faced colonel named Patricia Morrison, spoke in a voice that betrayed no emotion. "Captain Sarah Mitchell, this board finds you guilty of all charges as specified. You did willfully disobey direct orders from a superior officer. You did take unauthorized control of military equipment. Your actions directly resulted in the destruction of valuable military property." Sarah stood at attention, ready to hear her sentence. "However," Morrison continued, "this board must also recognize the extraordinary circumstances and results of your actions. You saved 540 American lives at tremendous personal risk. You displayed courage, skill, and devotion to duty far beyond the call." She paused. "This board hereby sentences you to a formal reprimand to be placed in your permanent record. You are further stripped of 6 months' pay to contribute to the cost of the destroyed aircraft." Sarah's knees nearly buckled. That was nothing, barely a slap on the wrist. "Additionally," Morrison said, and now there was the hint of a smile on her stern face, "this board recommends Captain Sarah Mitchell for the Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism in combat conditions." Dismissed. The courtroom erupted in cheers. Marines who'd been sitting silently shot to their feet, applauding and shouting. Sarah stood frozen in shock as her crew rushed forward to embrace her. Marcus was crying. Wilson was laughing. Amy just kept saying, "I knew it, I knew it." Colonel Hayes approached, his expression finally showing emotion, pride clear and unambiguous. "Captain Mitchell, you scared 10 years off my life. Don't ever do anything like that again." "No, sir," Sarah said, smiling through tears. "Once was enough." 6 months later, Sarah stood in dress blues as the commandant of the Marine Corps pinned the Navy Cross on her uniform. The medal felt heavy, but not as heavy as the memory of those 7 flights through hell. In the audience sat all 540 Marines from Rivera's battalion. Those who could travel had come from across the country. They stood as one when her name was called, saluting the woman who'd refused to leave them behind. The story became legend. It was taught at officer training schools as a case study in crisis decision-making. The Super Stallion's wreckage was recovered, and pieces of it were displayed at the Marine Corps Museum. Young pilots wrote Sarah letters asking for advice, for inspiration, for hope that one person could make a difference. But the moment Sarah treasured most came 3 years later at a wedding in Ohio. Lieutenant Jake Peterson, her friend from flight school who she'd heard screaming over the radio that terrible day, married his longtime girlfriend. At the reception, he raised his glass for a toast. "There's someone here tonight who's the reason I'm standing at all," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Sarah Mitchell flew through impossible conditions 7 times to bring us home. Every person in Rivera's battalion owes her their life. I owe her mine." He looked at Sarah, tears in his eyes. "Thank you for not following orders. Thank you for following your heart. Thank you for being a Marine." The room erupted in applause. Sarah stood, overwhelmed, as Marines and their families surrounded her, people she'd saved, children who existed because their fathers had made it home, wives who still had husbands, parents who still had children. Later that night, alone in her hotel room, Sarah looked at her Navy Cross. The medal represented extraordinary heroism, but what it really represented was a choice. The choice to risk everything for others. The choice to believe that 540 lives mattered more than regulations. The choice to fly into hell because it was the right thing to do. Years later, when young officers asked if she'd do it again, Sarah would look at the photographs covering her office wall. 540 Marines at weddings, graduations, birthday parties, holding bobbies, living lives they almost didn't have. She'd think about Private Tyler Bennett, who died 2 days after she saved him, but who'd gotten to say goodbye to his mother. She'd think about her destroyed helicopter giving everything it had until there was nothing left. And she'd answer the same way every time, her voice clear and certain, every single time, without hesitation, because that's what Marines do. We don't leave our people behind. Not ever. The story of Captain Sarah Mitchell and the 540 Marines became more than history. It became a reminder that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is disobey an order. That sometimes rules exist to be broken when lives hang in the balance. That one person making one impossible choice can change everything. And in hangars across Marine Corps bases, pilots would look at their helicopters and whisper a prayer to fly as bravely as the woman who flew through hell 7 times and brought everyone home. The end.
Che cosa cazzo volevi stamattina? Perché tu mi hai chiamato alle 10 del mattino mentre io stavo beatamente dormendo? Ho visto una chiamata, ma il bello è che non ho neanche visto il tuo numero. Mi è uscito questo numero con accanto... Sì. Mi è uscito un numero con accanto potrebbe essere e mi ha messo il tuo nome. No, cosa ridi? No, cosa ridi? Io non ti vedo da un mese, tu mi sbuchi così. No, cosa cazzo ridi?